So in early October, many of you who watch Level 1 News probably have already heard about this, but Bloomberg released an article alleging that everything has been hacked and we're all going to die and China's going to get all our information. And it's affected quite a few people, according to this article.
30 companies, they said, although among those 30 companies were Google and Amazon, who have both said absolutely not.
Relatively small companies.
And they said they were in the government, who said absolutely not. And then we had foreign governments that said absolutely not.
Though they had 7 anonymous sources who said absolutely. So who can say?
Can we trust anonymous sources? I would say no. Can we trust Google and Amazon? Absolutely not. Can we trust any government? Certainly not.
But can you trust Level 1?
What can we do? How can we figure this out?
We can show that it's total bullshit by doing exactly what the article says. We're going to compromise this server in exactly the way that it's compromised in the article.
So we're going to talk about the steps that may have led to how the Chinese or whoever attacked a server by attacking this innocent old server, this old Dell server.
Bless it.
Well, I mean, you think about it. Like, think about when this was new. Like, you order it from Dell and it shows up. Who would think that somebody has tampered with it between, Dell and you? Like, that doesn't even make sense. And most people don't think about that.
Other than, the package guy, dumping it on your doorstep, you don't think about it.
The UPS guy's my enemy.
Yeah.
The UPS guy is nice around here. Come on, everybody loves the UPS guys.
It's the other guys.
They promote from within. Those guys, they latch onto that job for life.
How much do you think you'd have to pay a UPS guy that it's like, hey, if you're delivering any package from Dell to this address, I'll give you $10,000 if you give me 30 minutes alone with it?
Well, you don't pay him.
$20,000?
You abduct his children.
Oh, okay.
And then you take them to China.
Or just take part of their fingers and
he gets them back.
It's like the New York UPS guy, I guess.
So let's talk about how it was alleged that this happened. They talked about the chip. Krista's favorite part is that it's the size of a pencil lead.
That's all the pictures show it. It's really tiny. There's another picture on this article where it's like the size of someone's fingertip.
It's actually much smaller than this one.
I don't have a surface mount the chip with which we're going to compromise it, so we're going to use a dip chip, but it works just the same.
But their chip was supposed to be in the form of a signal conditioner, but not really a signal conditioner. It was actually, on a bus somewhere important, and it was affecting things with a very tiny amount of memory, a very tiny amount of power, and it was very, very good subterfuge, according to Bloomberg.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you're probably watching in 4K, but it's like 1 pixel on our 4K display. It's so tiny.
This is actually one of those instances where the circle is useful because you wouldn't see it otherwise.
Well, and the silicon inside here, like if we were to shave down this package, the silicon in this package would be that big or smaller. So, I mean, it's not, you can easily, make that leap of imagination.
So here with our regular old Dell server, how can we go from healthy, robust Dell server to entirely compromised with just that?
My approach would be through the IP management interface. So with Dell, you've got the IPMI, and so you can get an add-in card like this one, which will just go in the back, and this gives you a separate SD card for storage and an Ethernet interface for remote control of the server. But the cool thing about this is that as long as the server's plugged into power, this is operational. It's a computer within a computer. There's RAM that's already soldered on the motherboard. This is a glorified SD card that contains the operating system, which is Linux-based, as it turns out. And this whole thing runs outside the rest of the system. But it's got enough access to the system that it can pull the MAC address, it can interface with the network, it can turn the server on and off, it can do like all of the doomsday scenario stuff they're describing for China. It does this, and it does this by design because you buy 50 of these servers and you want to control them all at once. That's how you do it.
And more importantly, as we've learned from the Intel Management Engine, and AMD had their own scandal, it is not visible for a normal user. Like everything else about your system can be tested and will come out completely clean. But this management engine exists separately, so you would never find it using normal methods.
A lot of the management engines are also proprietary. So like Dell and Intel don't make their management engine source codes available. So it's really hard to know if your management engine has been compromised in the first place. And so with Dell specifically, Serve the Home recently disclosed a vulnerability called iDracula. And the iDracula vulnerability is exactly the kind of software vulnerability that we're describing. With iDracula, you don't even need the EEPROM. You don't need it. You can just do it in software.
Conveniently enough, this one hasn't been patched, so we're going to violate it.
We're going to violate it, and we're going to make it so that it can't be patched after we violated it. Once we violated it, there's no getting rid of us. We're in there. We're like a tick. We're embedded.
So I want to know, will this affect me? Do I need to do anything to prevent the Chinese from getting all my information?
Well, as Bloomberg pointed out, this affects everyone. We should all be terrified of the evil Chinese. But in reality, this kind of thing, it's not like a traditional hack, quote unquote, in that it's not going to take over the main system. So the question is, we have to ask ourselves, if this happened, what were they trying to do?
It's really difficult to know without actually analyzing the device, but you got to imagine that if they deployed these devices and they started using them immediately, they would almost certainly be detected. There would be network traffic, there would be unusual network traffic to China. It's like, why is my server constantly connected to China?
And that is, they reported, that's how they found out. Someone actually had the sense to look at the network and said, hey, that's weird, look at that.
What's going on here? So maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's more information there, but it could have just as easily been a software hack. There's no reason to say that some server admin didn't patch their server and that's how it got infected. That's how it got compromised. It doesn't necessarily mean that the supply chain is compromised. A lot of these things introduce a weakness where it could be exploited later. It's just going to lie in wait there.
And with our system here, that would certainly be the case because the vulnerability that we would use to get into it has been patched. But there's always an amount of time after it's announced that's vulnerable. And if you're China and you're already inside, Chinese inside, then you're ready at a moment's notice to take advantage of that. And your systems might be in very sensitive places.
Yeah, for our particular modification where we're modifying the EEPROM, we're basically just making it so that you can't patch the eMMC, the storage device basically for this management controller. So we just, when we deploy this, we don't necessarily know that there's a vulnerability. It just lies in wait. And then it's like, oh, there's a vulnerability that will give us full remote access to the server. We exploit that, and then we prevent anybody from being able to patch that in the future. In fact, if a sysadmin comes along and tries to patch it, the system will tell them that it's patched, but it's not.
So you're totally safe, is the short answer there.
Okay.
Right.
TLDR.
Unless you go to work for Amazon or Google or the
Or
TSA.
any number of other companies that have been compromised by this.
It was all in server hardware. They, of course, didn't go after desktops because it's too risky to get caught, right? I mean, you hit high value targets with something like this.
Well, and it's too hard to get information out once, even if you completely own the system, it's a one-shot deal to get your information out.
So we talked about how we hit this management thing, and that's a way in. There have been people who infected various hardware firmwares to get in that way. That's all somewhat detectable. So why go with the extra piece of hardware? And the extra piece of hardware, really all it does is it gives you that ability to lie to people who are trying to fix it.
Yeah, it makes it hard to detect. It's called an indicator of compromise. And so you might be able to use an extra piece of hardware to mask an indicator of compromise. Of course, if everybody knows the piece of hardware is there, well, that sort of defeats the ability for you to use that to mask an indicator of compromise.
But we also know from Bloomberg that supposedly some driver portals were compromised, and there was another variable to this hack. So they might not necessarily just have the tiny chip. There might be other parts that granted them access. And that's kind of what we did here to our Dell. We know a vulnerability. We're able to downgrade something to affect that vulnerability, and then we're able to mask it with a tiny piece of hardware.
I mean, Krista, wouldn't you freak out if I told you it's like, I've got, I don't have the password to this server for the operating system, and I don't have access to it otherwise, but I can remote into it, I can read system memory, I can turn it off, I can turn it on, I can query the peripherals.
Certainly make me nervous if I had some websites hosted on that server.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a lot different than that, but that's what it's designed to do. There's a management engine in there that's what it does.
And maybe one of the most important things we can take away from this is we talk about that management engine, and that is and how sensitive and vulnerable it is.
And how poorly documented it is.
And Then we look at Australia. That is the side gate, literally. This horrible thing that China's going to use to destroy us, that's the side gate. And once it's installed, all security goes out the window because of things like this.
So if you're a business or an individual, what can you do to protect yourself against this kind of thing? Like, what if somebody's going to spend a bunch of money and bribe your UPS guy? Could somebody do the same kind of thing to, like, hack your MacBook or whatever, put a back door on it? I mean, it seems like the answer is yeah, but they'd have to be interested in you specifically.
You got to think they could. Now, according to Bloomberg, and again, everything according to Bloomberg, you cast a little bit of doubt on because
everybody's denying it.
It seems so unlikely and everybody's denying it. But
salt.
their way of catching it was to literally compare the board with a spec sheet and count the signal conditioners. I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of time.
No.
So it is difficult. If you're a high value target and you're getting something shipped to you, it's going to be difficult.
Well, I mean, would you even notice? I mean, if I had the surface mount EEPROM and soldered it on the motherboard underneath the real one,
Well, yeah, I mean, we should note that
you wouldn't even know.
this is covered up by this whole piece right here.
Yeah, so
you get that under there, and how many users are going to pop that off?
Well, if you're Amazon and you're ordering 1,000 servers at a time, you're literally going to go from box to rack in 5 minutes. You're not even going to take it apart.
So, we should also mention that, okay, so this was covered with this little cover right here. It was mounted on top of that thing, under this spring, under this card. So all of that has to come out, and then you have to start counting things and looking at them and comparing them to a picture.
It'd take me about 30 minutes.
Well, then, Amazon's all about efficiency, so obviously they're going to be doing that every single time. Every time. They'll always count it.
This is a really great segue into what do the intelligence organizations actually do? If only we had some lens into what they were doing and what kind of devices they have for this kind of compromise.
Well, some of our viewers are listening to this and are like, oh, this is horrible. And some of them are like, I don't understand this. And other ones are like, what's the part number for that thing?
I need to order that.
But they're in luck.
Yeah, it turns out that the Snowden leaks have given us the NSA fantasy catalog. So with the NSA catalog, it's like all the stuff that you can order. And one of the it's like an RF bug of some kind of radio frequency bug. It looks exactly like it looks like a black version of the signal conditioner that's in the Supermicro thing. Now it's on a carrier PCB with wires, but it seems like you could just as easily solder it on the motherboard instead of having it on a carrier PCB, but it looks the same.
Do you think if the NSA sold the chip that the Chinese used against us, they would then deny that it exists?
That's what happened. But there's stuff in this catalog for key logging and for RF detection and audio bugs. There are USB cables that look like normal USB cables, but that record all the information through them, or at least the last 8 gigabytes.
It's like a Sears catalog for Christmas time.
It's like a Sears catalog if you're like despotic.
So I guess ultimately the answer here is it's unrealistic to ever trust hardware unless you created it and it's never been out of your sight. And really, I think the realistic option here is network monitoring as the way to go to try and defeat this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, even network monitoring, it's easy to imagine that you could leak little bits of information without any kind of network monitoring software actually detecting it. Like Heartbleed. Imagine a world where Heartbleed was actually the work of some intelligence organization. It's going to leak server memory a few bytes at a time. That went for like 10 years without anybody noticing. So if that was planted 10 years ago, the intelligence community had 10 years of leaking server memory a few bytes at a time, but that's plenty to extract an encryption key or a password or something like that, but you're not going to be, you're not going to be hoovering up all the Facebook data, but you could steal passwords. So final verdict on the Bloomberg article, plausible, but not likely actually anything super damaging.
Myth busted.
And if it was happening, it's probably not unique to the Chinese government.
The more it's exploited and weaponized, the faster we'll detect it and fix it. So that's a positive message, right?
As positive as you'll get from this channel, I think.
Yeah.